the speaker needs no introduction. Brad Olson has, I think, spoken to this council before. He's going to give us some insights into where he sees the economy going in the future. So without any further ado, Brad, over to you.
Kia ora, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for having me again this morning. It is good to be back, and always good to be back in person. Gives us a lot of perspective when we travel around the regions. I thought I'd start today with a few reflections. I was fortunate enough earlier this year to travel over to Switzerland in January when everyone else was having fun in the sun. I went to the -2s to -15s of Davos to the World Economic Forum's annual meeting and got to engage with a number of key decision makers. And I just thought it was an interesting, different perspective from what we often see and hear in New Zealand. We are, for better or for worse, isolated at the bottom of the South Pacific, and that's sometimes good because we are isolated from some of the challenges that the rest of the world goes through, but equally we don't always get some of those same insights. So I thought I'd offer you a few reflections on that first from sort of a strategic perspective, and then I'll give you some of the more general economic update, and then after that, I'm more than happy to take any and all of your questions on anything I've discussed or anything else I can give a crack at. Certainly on the international front, there are some sort of rising and sustained concerns around global conflict, but also sort of how that conflict might well play out. You look at the likes of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that's continuing now into multiple years, and the fact that there seems to be a fair amount of stalemate there. Obviously, the Israel-Palestine conflict that has huge humanitarian challenges that are coming through, at the same time as indirect economic impacts with the likes of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and what that does to shipping costs and similar, and still risks and concerns around the wider sort of Asia-Pacific region, particularly in the South China Sea, saber rattling between the likes of China, Taiwan, and similar, a lot more in our neck of the woods. It was interesting that certainly the view internationally and particularly in Europe and the UK is a lot stronger than I think we anticipate here in New Zealand. I expect everyone here, if I asked anyone on the street if they thought that war was coming globally, I genuinely don't think many people would hop up and say, yeah, absolutely. Over there, it is much more of a, yes, it's a question of when sort of issue. To the point as well where they are, in a sense, putting their money where their mouths are in terms of opening or reopening armaments factories that have been closed for about 20 years, replenishing shell stocks and similar after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So very different risk tone that I think started to emerge there compared to where we are here in New Zealand, which presents a more strategic challenge. One of the bigger concerns, in a sense, is what that would look like in a world now that is a lot more interconnected than when other conflicts have arisen. You look at, for example, China being the top export destination for about 100 countries in the world. Previously, you look at the likes of World War II, when Europe was taken over by the Germans. You had Japan invade China. A lot of those didn't have big ramifications for the global economy. These days, those sort of same changes would have quite enormous ramifications. And it was just one of those things that came through as a rising strategic risk for New Zealand. We're far away, and that's good from the point of view of we might not be in direct conflict, but it also means that we're far away from anything that needs to get here or that we need to send out. And so if those sort of shipping issues and similar come through, we are going to be a lot more isolated. That's starting to emerge again indirectly with what's happening through in the Red Sea. New Zealand doesn't put a huge amount of stuff through the Red Sea route, so we're not or haven't seen as direct of an impact. General shipping costs globally have tripled from the end of last year to where we are now. They've thankfully started a plateau, which is encouraging. They're not getting worse, although it's still quite uncomfortable. As a reference point, during COVID, you saw that freight costs increased 11 times what they normally were at the peak, so sort of 3 times is a lot better than that 11 times, but also still quite a bit more than it was before. The risk probably more for New Zealand is that we seem to have a bit of a delayed impact on the shipping and freight front, and that sort of has meant or could risk that if a ship's taking an extra 14 to 21 days that our shipments can't make their way around the world if containers, for example, aren't in the right place. We've already started hearing some of that. You know, if someone's supposed to pick up a container in Singapore and bring it back, down to New Zealand full of, I don't know, building products or whatever, ship pulls up in Singapore and that container's still on a ship that's being rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, then again, that container doesn't make its way here. That container might not be able to be loaded with New Zealand exports and then taken to the next port either, because it's physically in the wrong spot. So sort of that how the interplay, if you will, between conflict and trade and economics is becoming, I think, starker than ever, and so some real global risks. That's sort of point one. The other 2 points, one around interest rates and one around AI and digital technology, before I briefly turn to climate change and then the local stuff. On interest rates, of course, that's something that New Zealand is focusing on a lot at the moment, has real implications for households, has real implications for businesses, has real implications for organisations like yourself when it comes to borrowing and what that outlook will appear like. Again, in New Zealand, we focus a lot on what's happening domestically, but we also probably should take some cues from what's happening globally as well. It was somewhat reassuring talking to central bank governors from the likes of the French Central Bank, the former Bank of England chair, the Central Bank of Peru and similar. They are actually all in a similar place to us. Broadly speaking, everyone thinks they've done enough on raising interest rates to curb inflation, but they might well have to hold them for longer to keep sort of squashing inflation back. Most of them were a little bit probably more candid than we might have in New Zealand around people who are willing to sort of say, look, we think the next interest rate move is down, but they're also quite unwilling to put a time frame on that, an expectation that we're moving in the right direction, the plan is working, but it might well take a while. So that was encouraging, I think, from the New Zealand point of view, that we're not out of step with the rest of the world on that sort of outlook as well. The other bit, though, and one that came through quite strongly, was there always seems to be a bit of a buzzword at a lot of these international conferences, and previous times it's been around, you know, cryptocurrencies or whatever else it might be. This year it was all about AI, and sort of obvious after you've had ChatGPT and similar take over a lot of conversations in the last year or two. What I found probably most interesting is that you had some quite differing views. So we heard from the UN Secretary General, who made it clear that tech firms at the moment who have AI capabilities are the ones that are quite possibly sort of rorting the system and, you know, extracting some pretty significant profits. If you've got access to that technology, you're on a win, and if you don't, you're increasingly left behind the 8 ball. But we also heard from the likes of the IMF that actually AI and some of those digital innovations could well worsen inequality rather than help it. So again, just a bit of a challenge over sort of business practice versus sort of social outcomes for people. The most fascinating around AI, though, was talking to a number of businesses that said, look, if I am a business that produces AI, if I'm a Microsoft and OpenAI, any of those organizations, I'm probably making a mint. If I'm not, if I'm an organization who's trying to think about incorporating AI into my business, I'm suffering some big challenges. I want to do it, I want to use it, I want to become more productive, but I'm just not quite sure how to bring it into my organization in sort of a safe manner. What are the guardrails that I need to put around it? You saw this recently, and to give you an example, particularly given what the committee focuses on, I think it was Air Canada recently had a chatbot that was completely AI driven. And someone messaged into the bot and said, look, have an urgent request. Family members died or is injured or something or other. I need a compassionate fare. You know, I need to fly tonight. You know, what's your compassionate fare policy? And the AI bot said, no worries, book your flight, we'll reimburse you afterwards. It's all good. And so this person took screenshots of the AI bot and bought their flight and went off and, you know, had to look after the family member or whatever else it might have been. Eventually went back to the airline and said, hey, just looking for that reimbursement. And they said, oh, no, that's not our policy. You've got to have it approved beforehand. And they're like, but your AI bot told me it, and here are the receipts. And it did become a big issue of, well, that is, you know, publishing under the company's focus. You know, you can't just say, well, it's the bot and it's not our policy. If the bot speaks for the company, the bot speaks for the company. And so it has just highlighted that sort of need to be quite careful around the guardrails in terms of what proprietary information goes in, but also sort of to what degree you allow these systems to talk for you and sort of what guidance there is. That was something that came through quite clearly from businesses themselves internationally, is that a lot are getting into it, a lot are probably moving in a sense almost too fast. They're more than willing to break things and give it a go. Others are a lot more resistant to making big moves because they are worried about, social license to operate. They're worried about the implications, and they'd like a lot more guidance on that. Now, like I say, that's not necessarily for this committee to decide, but I just thought it was an interesting piece where we are moving in that direction. AI does produce some big advantages, but there is, I think, a rising question over the guardrails, the safeguards around use, around privacy and protection, around intellectual property, and what have you. The other interesting piece, and I certainly found this valuable coming from a New Zealand perspective, was trying to get a bit of an update on the global state of play, if you will, around sort of climate change thinking. And I say that sort of from almost a business point of view rather than anything else. It wasn't sort of heavily from, experts in the field, but it was more what the implementation looked like. I was fortunate enough to talk to the likes of, I think it was one of the vice presidents of Nestle, one of the major buyers of New Zealand products through Fonterra, for example, and sort of trying to understand a lot more of that demand-driven shift. So not just sort of climate change or shift for climate change's sake. It was more what's the sort of business prerogative. And that was coming through very clearly in terms of both customer demand in Europe, but more importantly, regulation in Europe sort of moving ahead of everyone else. Now, you can make the case that maybe they've got a better social conscience than other parts of the world, but that was a very, very strong demand shift. If you can't meet those requirements, then there will be an increasing number of companies that will not buy from you, and the economic ramifications were quite clear. So that was interesting to hear, because I think it's been a bit harder to understand some of those trends through New Zealand, but also talking to a number of other nations who did call out that some of the action from bigger countries has not only been slow, but also challenging in terms of financing. So I talked to the Trade and Investment Minister from Papua New Guinea, obviously one of the countries more affected by climate change than otherwise in our neck of the woods. And they highlighted that for all of the good talk that goes on at international fora like the one we were at, the actual commitments of money seem to be great to put on press releases and hard to actually access. So still a feeling that around the world there is quite a bit of work to come. To pivot then a little bit more domestically, but sort of related, of course, there's a lot happening in the government realm as well with the change of government. Yesterday, new information came out from the Climate Change Commission on expectations there, which again starts to have a real economic impact for government. Some of the expectations from the Climate Change Commission were to reduce the number of carbon credits issued out into the system. Now that is, certainly from a climate perspective, quite smart. It restricts the amount of outgoings and therefore limits our emissions. If you're a government, though, that's banking on a certain amount of credits being sold at a certain price to make a certain amount of money that you then put into the budget, you ain't got that money no more. And so again, there are some sort of, again, wider economic impacts that start to come through that do challenge and will be challenging the government through this year. That seems to be coming through on multiple fronts in terms of the likes of transport funding, with the recent government policy statement on land transport coming out. Again, sort of shifting in, I think, where anyone who's sort of been looking at news in the last 6 months would have realised that direction of travel, but a bit more definitive trend on the numbers now coming through from government as well. Long story short, I think on the government front is that there is a huge amount of work that wants to be done by government agencies, by government itself, and increasingly limited funding. The amount of revenue that government's collecting is not nearly as strong as it could be. It's only up about 3% in the last 12 months. You take into account the fastest population growth that New Zealand's seen since the end of the Second World War at 2.8%. You take into account inflation of 4.7%, and total tax take up 3% is fairly weak on an adjusted basis. And so we are expecting that budget this year, for example, will be a lot more limited. There won't be nearly as much coming out from government. Just the last bit, and only because I'm keen to turn this into a conversation after I've sort of rattled on for 20 minutes, is what we're seeing more in the regional space. Regional economies are under more pressure, and we've started to see that probably a lot clearer almost in the last 3 to 5 months. Up until sort of September, a lot of the trends were holding up probably better than we'd expected, and that was being reflected then in our own expectations for the economy going forward. Migration was high, and that was adding a lot to demand, and that was adding a lot to spending. And in a sense, that higher migration was offsetting the higher interest rates that were curbing spending activity on a household basis. Since then, things have turned around a bit. Consumer spending at the end of last year, latest data we've got detailed information for, highlighted that for the first time that there was a decline in spending in the December quarter compared to a year ago, for the first time since effectively the global financial crisis, if you strip out the 2 lockdowns that New Zealand had. So consumer spending in December 2023 lower than the December quarter in 2022. That happened when Delta was coming through and when the original lockdown came through, quite understandably. You have to go back to September 2009 before you see that same annual fall. So households are very much spending a lot more on the mortgage, and that's starting to translate through a lot harder, a lot quicker into other spending decisions. In fact, we now are seeing that consumer spending per person on an inflation-adjusted basis is 2% below pre-pandemic levels. So that's quite a shift back in momentum. The positive, in a sense, is that inflation is getting better, and that sort of expectation is for that to continue. We have seen inflation moderate to 4.7% from 7.3%. We're likely to see it start with a 3 in the next couple of months, which will be encouraging. And the Reserve Bank is broadly comfortable with the work that it's been doing to raise interest rates to curb inflation. It's going a bit slower than they might have expected, but they're happy enough with progress. But they have signalled that they expect interest rates to remain on hold for a while. So I think the sort of tone that we're coming to at the moment is that the expectation for New Zealand's economy is that there will be a soft landing. That doesn't mean that it won't be a landing at all. It's still, even a soft landing sort of jolts the knees a bit, but we're not likely to see it sort of spill over yet. The concern or the challenge might well be that we have to take a bit of a breath once we've sort of hit the decks before we start to run away again. And so in our minds, you could see fairly subdued and restrained growth for the next sort of 12 to 18 months until the Reserve Bank is confident enough that it's got inflation under control. It'll start to drop interest rates. That won't be quick. It won't be swift. It won't be large. It'll be a bit. They'll be a bit more restrained as well. They won't want to let inflation roar away again. Just very finally, given where we are in this part of the country, of course, the primary sector is still a major part and contributor to the economy. We're seeing, in a sense, still a lot of pressure on the primary sector, but some more encouraging signs in some areas. The likes of the dairy payout continuing to improve relative to where it was before. We're also seeing the on-farm costs have plateaued. So at a high level, don't get me wrong, but in the last quarter, on-farm costs were the same as they were the quarter before on average. And so that's sort of an encouraging sign that, again, we're starting to curb some of those pressures. Other parts of the sector are a lot more stressed. The likes of the meat sector, for example, lamb prices at a 7-year low, beef prices at a 3-year low. Horticulture starting to recover, but forestry remaining fairly constrained. So a feeling that on the whole, high costs and not as good revenue as before will constrain sort of provincial spending for a while. Urban areas probably have a little bit more oomph at the moment, but that's equally because they didn't have a lot during COVID, whereas provincial areas had a lot more oomph during COVID, not quite as much room to manoeuvre now. With that sort of tirade of economic trends from the global and the strategic down to sort of more of the national and the local, I'll shut up for a second, but be more than happy to take any and all of your questions.
Chris.
Thanks, Graham. Brad, thanks very much for that overview. Very informative. Just a question on China. Everything I read about China at the moment is negative. Seems to be going down in an ever-increasing rates, and I read yesterday, I think, about the significance of that on the international economy, but more particularly on New Zealand, because we've got significant trade imbalance between ourselves. Do you want to comment on that and elaborate on the potential for that having a significant impact on New Zealand over the next 12, 18 months as against the interest rate regime?
Definitely, and I was fortunate enough, but because of all these negative stories, and trust me, I've been reading them as well, I got myself to China at the end of last year to try and get a boots on the ground view. What was probably most interesting was that everything you're reading in that negativity is very much there. I mean, on a number of fronts. At the moment, you're seeing a sort of a structural shift in a sense, where for a long time you've seen the property sector in China be a pretty major contributor. Around 25% of their GDP can be sheeted back to property and what have you. That increasingly becomes quite risky, and for them they'd sort of been overloading themselves on debt. They'd been sort of building, in a sense, too much to try and keep things moving. And now that's come back, it's meant that other parts of the economy are grinding to a halt. If they're not building the apartment building that they were thinking of before, that means that the local government doesn't get any money, which means they can't invest in infrastructure, which means those jobs go as well, and so on and so forth. The wider challenge, I think, is seems to be a bit of a shift more broadly in China to a weaker growth footing. I mean, it's still a big economy. It's still urbanizing at pace, and that still brings a lot of people who could well, spend on, for example, New Zealand goods and services. It's just that China's population has now declined for the second year in a row. It's the only time since the Great Famine of the early 1960s that China's population has actually shrunk. If the idea was, and it was after the GFC, that our trade and export growth was predicated on lots of additional Chinese consumers, that's not coming through as strongly anymore. And so whereas previously you might have expected, say, 5% growth in the Chinese economy, over the next couple of years, you might be looking at something closer to 3 to 4. It's still growth, but it's not nearly as easy. What we did find is that there is a lot more competition on the ground in China, both domestically and from international. So domestically, because there's a more challenging economy, you're seeing that the youth unemployment rate has been quite high, and so that's a struggle in terms of purchases. That was often, a good proving ground for New Zealanders to get in and market to. But at the same time, you're seeing a lot of more international competition. So dairy, just because it is a big part and a big sector, obviously here and in China, we found that they're doing a lot more domestically on selling their own story of the importance of dairy. So are other countries as well, though. Ireland have probably snuck ahead of us, I suspect, in some of the ways that they market and how they profile out to Chinese consumers. So all of that's coming through. It is, I think, harder to operate. There's changes, that come through from government at the drop of a hat. While I was over there, in fact, the Chinese decided to change regulations around deer velvet. It went from, it had to all be frozen. New Zealand doesn't have the capacity to freeze a lot of our deer velvet that goes over. But what I would say in terms of maybe not optimism, we're expecting that restraint to continue for a while. And I think if it's the sort of thing when that was New Zealand's sort of lightning bolt strike idea for how we continue to grow the economy, it's not going to be as strong a growth going forward. But it's still 1.2 billion people. It's still a very, very large economy with a lot of consumers. We don't have to market to every single one of them. We've just got to do it well in a slightly more premium space to a certain group of consumers. Tip Top, for example, I think operates in like one city in China and still does quite well out of it. So I think it's probably just that we need to refocus on what is our strategy there, because it used to be send anyone there and you can sort of, you could get off the plane unintentionally in China and do quite well because of how strong things were. We now, I think, need to have a slightly more deliberate strategy and focus a little bit more on what are our competitive advantages, because they're not as strong as they used to be.
Chris.
Thanks very much, Brad. Always appreciate you coming and sharing your thoughts. Two questions. One is with the reduction in central government spending, out in the regions, rates are already pretty high. We're at the lower end of it, by the way. But yeah, but it's how do you see that panning out? Do you see more expectation of councils to deliver? And the other one is around the ETS. I mean, I heard on the radio the suggestion from the Climate Change Commission that the current ETS can't meet our obligations and it could hit us quite hard financially. Got any views on that?
Yeah, so responding to the first one, I mean, Wellington's quite a sad place at the moment, to be frank, in terms of those cutbacks. It has sort of reverberated quite quickly. There's still a lot of uncertainty of exactly what that looks like sort of once the process plays out, once you get the budget out in May and similar. But the too long don't read is that I know quite clearly of public sector agencies that have been cutting back on staff and other things. I know of private sector agencies who have cut entire teams as well because they service government and government won't be buying from them anymore. The difficulty, I think, is that there is still quite a sustained demand for those services from government. I mean, lot harder to take stuff away than to give stuff to people. And I mean that in terms of all services that are being discussed and are on the table. Certainly locally, I think there's a big discussion there as well over, well, why are rates increases so high? And I should have a bit more publicly to say about that tomorrow. With all going well, but long story short, I mean, without knowing and not wanting to mention exactly the numbers I've heard around the country, but from what I understand, yours would be one of the lower ones I've heard. The sort of this is an anecdotal average. This is not an official average, but sort of when we're talking around the country, the sort of anecdotal average tends to be in that sort of 15 to 17% range. And I think the worry is that a lot of those continue thereafter. It's not just 1 year bump up and then afterwards it's not quite as big. It seems to be that and then even more going on. The difficulty is that the costs have increased so significantly in recent years in terms of interest repayments, but a lot of the time other physical infrastructure and similar has accelerated so much. So I do think that there is there's a greater question coming from the public that's sure over, you know, what am I getting, not only for my money, but, you know, who's delivering XYZ service. And I do think that local government will come under some pressure there. I do think as well, though, that's why it's probably quite important to have that honest and difficult conversation with the community over, this is how much it costs to run the services, and you community make a choice. Do you want the services and you're willing to pay for it? Or if you're not willing to pay for it, what are you not wanting to receive? And that's a very difficult conversation, but I think it is quite a serious one. I might well have said it to this committee before. I know I've said it around the country. If you look at just on a capital basis, if you as a council, for example, had 5 $20 million projects last LTP round, you'd currently be having to cut one of them to fund the cost escalation on the other 4. That's the sort of conversation you're now getting to with the community, where it's almost not quite a 1 in, 1 out scenario, but it's not nearly the ability to add additional to what you've had. Everything is going up in cost. I mean, public transport use continues to escalate. So I think there is a greater demand. There is certainly a pullback from central government, but there's also, I think you're right, almost a rising expectation from local government because you are local. You know, even a local MP, although they are good, they can sheet it back to, well, cabinet said or government department said or similar. You know, you guys are local, you exist in the community, you've got an office building in the middle of your community. It's a lot easier to sort of, you know, ask for that. And also, and I'm sure I've made this point before, because and noting that your revenue lines are limited to what you're given, everyone normally can name their rates bill down to $1 because it's a very direct ask. Whereas in terms of your tax bill, I wouldn't know exactly how much tax I pay every year because I never really see it. It's not that I lose it, I just never get it. Whereas for this, you have to give something back. I'm not saying, I mean, that's not a solution, but it is a psychological thing that we have seen in economics before. To your other point on the ETS, I mean, one of the challenges that seems to have come up from the Climate Change Commission is around the fact that there is a lot of forestry that's been ongoing and similar, and that's adding more and more credits into the system. In a sense, I think that might well be a slightly misguided view of how things need to change. I mean, that is still a legitimate way of doing it. The difficulty is that the entire number of credits that we're issuing out into the system is too high relative to what we need to meet our goals, especially from a funded point of view. Because we do provide quite a huge amount of free allocation to various industries, partly to protect them from overseas and you know, ensure comparability. But I think there are questions in some areas, and I know that I've been part of these conversations where they've been raised, that sometimes that free allocation seems to be quite overly generous and therefore sort of you do it there and it means that across the board there's more emissions that could happen. If I'm a business that you know, should get, say, 50 credits and I instead get 100, then I don't have to buy the other 50 credits I might have thought I needed from the market, and that means that there's 50 more for other pollution to occur in other areas. So I think that the intuition there seems to be that there is a desire to reduce the amount of credits available on offer over time. The wider challenge, I think, for government is that at some point it seems like the rubber will hit the road where we need to do a whole lot to meet our international obligations. We won't be able to do that domestically. We'll have to then do it internationally and buy them in, and we haven't actually factored that into the budget. And I think that's probably one of the larger things. Like Treasury's got certain views, government ministers have got certain views, but there is I think, upwards or up to a $23 billion obligation or liability that is not currently on government books because it's not as easily quantified. And I get that, but if I was a business and I knew that, I'm effectively on the hook for that payment at some point, I feel like I'd probably start to provision for it at some point soon. We haven't yet done that. And so that's sort of a bit of a noose hanging around our neck at some point.
Just on those credits, one of the issues is the pool of unused credits sitting in the bank, if you like, is way too big. So the current government is saying, well, we're not going to subsidise EVs, we're going to use pricing mechanisms and the ETS is the key. But the ETS isn't going to work for a period because there's just too much in the bank. People are holding on to these credits. And in fact, the last couple of auctions didn't get away anyway, did they? So it's a really mixed up. It's not just simply that we need to issue less. It's that we need to get rid of the stock, if you like, in the bank. Is that right?
That's partly it. I mean, it's very difficult because on one hand, you'd almost want to say, well, that's easy. We'll just, cut a whole bunch of them or we'll do a 2-for-1 deal that, after a certain period, they're not worth as much. But of course, people bought them at the time on the provision that they would be able to use them. And they sort of, it's almost like an NZ post stamp, right? You got a stamp expecting that one stamp always sends a letter. And that sort of has to continue. Otherwise, everyone loses confidence in the system. And part of that is also why the auctions didn't clear in the last year or so, because the price sort of dropped to a point that everyone went, well, don't know if it's legit or not. Is it worth buying them, or is something else going to come through? And I think one of the challenges for government then is if you've got a large stockpile, and you're right that there is that stockpile there, how can you change the pricing dynamics? And this might be exactly what they do. If you were, for example, to clamp back massively on the amount of credits you issued, this is a stylized example, not actually what I expect they'll do. But let's say that this year they said, well, there's not going to be any on issue. Now, if I'm a company, I'm still polluting, I still need to have some credits. So I need to buy them from somewhere. Now, if I don't have any stockpiled myself, I have to go to you who's got some stockpiled in the bank, and I say, well, I'll pay you $60. And you're like, no, I'm waiting until they get to 200. And so I then shop around and figure out if anyone else is going to give them to me and at what price they actually become worthwhile. I mean, like I say, stylized example, but that is effectively, I think, the way that the government will likely move is that over time they will limit the amount going out, which will push up the price for all of them, banked and unallocated so far, because that will provide that sort of pricing signal. It does also mean, though, that over time, again, the price will rise and that will hit businesses and households and similar as well. So it's a very nice theoretical economic system. It really is. Pricing signals work great like that. The practicalities for households and similar are always more challenging than that.
Robbie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thanks, Brad, for coming in. Is the government, do you think the government's going to, you're saying that costs are going up and that, but no one's actually, I don't think enough work is going on the costs that it costs us to run business ourselves. So are they going to help us out with any of that to try and assess that, are we doing business in the correct way and are we doing it, do we need to broaden our horizons and think more of how we do business and linkages or amalgamations or whatever it is to try and drive costs? And I'm not saying bigger is better either, because if you look at efficiency, sometimes smaller is the best way to go. So I'm not, if I look at my own committees and self-administrating can be half the price of us running it, so there is benefits in being small and nimble and being able to change quickly. So have you got any ideas on that? Because it's something that's going to affect us big time in the next 10 years. Thank you.
There are, I think there are a few pieces of work that are going on to try and get there. A lot of them are possibly at the smaller end. I mean, for example, yesterday, I think it was, the Building and Construction Minister came out and said that work under a certain dollar value is exempt from some fees that have to be paid, which is likely to limit the amount of money that has to go out on certain projects and might enable some more of those projects. So that sort of thinking is useful. There's also a question, though, over, if you don't get the fees from those projects, what, again, doesn't get funded. And other areas as well where, government is thinking about regulation and the cost of doing business and similar. I suspect that one of the greater challenges is that a lot of the bigger stuff is difficult. And I say that in terms of, one, there is, I think, a real need for greater innovation at a technological level. Like, again, if you can get AI to work for you and similar, that's got a big advantage. But again, with the guide rails, and I suspect, I mean, the government's been looking at e-invoicing and what have you. And look, I know as a small business runner myself that, that those sort of things can take a lot of time and energy and effort that I can't then do on other things. I'd like to see more investment going into businesses as well, so they can buy better plant and equipment and all those sorts of things, but they're expensive. The wider piece, though, I think is around the general regulation bit. So you talked about, amalgamations and similar. I think that should be a conversation. I think the right sizing is important because some people, like you say, do seem to just go on a tear of bigger is better, or sometimes adding layers of bureaucracy. I think if you're going to amalgamate, you sort of have to, on whatever scale it is, you've got to be quite clear that you then quite definitively cut out that lower level. The worst bit, and I remember seeing this about 5 years ago, there was a proposal to add it was like a layer of like zones above school boards. And so you'd still have school boards and they'd still be paid the same, but they wouldn't do as much as they did before. And instead you'd have another group on top of them. That was a duplication of resource, adding in another layer. I would have been happier to go, well, school zones or whatever they were at the time does all the work and you get rid of boards of trustees if that was going to be the model. You sort of can't keep the old and the new because it just costs more. One of the bigger, or one of the, I think, broad challenges for that is that we struggle in New Zealand. We flip-flop between over-regulation and under-regulation. As soon as a big issue happens, everyone goes, we need to regulate against that because that's a bad outcome. And then we do that, and then everyone sort of complains about it. Gosh, you can look at that in terms of leaky homes. You can look at that in terms of, the likes of every time we have a review of the Health and Safety at Work Act, it's often because there's been a poor outcome. There'll be at some point that, again, you would have had 5 road codes and not 6, and someone would have had a passing miss, and then it was an obligation to have 20 on every work site, sort of thing. And at the time you go, well, that makes sense, and now everyone goes, maybe not. You get rid of it, and then people die, and then you go, why do we ever get rid of it? So I do worry that a lot of the time the worry seems to be the right fit bit is missing. And I think that a large part of that is probably because those decisions are made at too central of a level in Wellington without that sort of more practical knowledge. So, I guess an area that I'd be interested in, I say this having talked to people around this committee before, I'd like to think that some of that farm management plan stuff that's going on is probably in a better space because it is being run a bit more regionally, certainly rather than centrally. I'm happy to be told I'm wrong on that front, but I'd like to think that's sort of a better level of decision making and regulation setting that would come through.
Chris.
Sorry.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because I was at the Zone 2 meeting last week, and there's a couple of TAs just said, even if we just shared IT systems, that would help a lot, that they could share services. And that's just not even a discussion they ever have, and just the government should be just pushing to go, you guys need to have shared IT systems, and that would just save millions of dollars.
The other part, if I could, I think that, and this goes back then to the, making sure you strip out the layers. The difficulty there is that I can imagine that there would be a number of people that would also say, oh, but I need this special system to stick around for my area because of insert legacy thing here. And I think you're right, though, that those sort of conversations do need to go on. They do often have big advantages. They do often have a bit of an upfront cost, and that can be a bit hard to stomach. But a lot of the time, and this is where you'd eventually hope the district health boards and similar get to, some of those changes you'd expect you can get some back office efficiencies, but you also have to be quite ruthless in going, well, actually, we are going to, completely move that along. And I'm not sure, I think everyone does the first bit, and then when the implementation comes in, goes, oh, well, I need a little bit of whatever it is myself. So I think we've got to be a bit more ruthless on the delivery bit.
Chris.
Thanks, Graham. Brad, I'm not sure whether you're able to comment or make observations, something which I heard about last week. GJ Gardner's the biggest builder of homes in New Zealand, about $5,000 for the medium to top end, 2 bathrooms, laundry, kitchen.
500,000?
5,000, sorry, 5,000 per square metre.
Oh, so
Per square metre.
like, geez, can I get a $5,000 house in Waikato if I move here?
I'm talking about focus on the per square metre. That's a fully self-contained residence which is ready to be moved. All the appliances and that in there, no furnishings. I was told last week we've got a local primary school which is putting up another 4, or they're in the process of putting on 4 extra rooms. No services, no ablution blocks, just 4 classrooms without the furnishings included in them. It's an add-on at the end. And the cost of those, I'm told, is $15,000 a square metre. Can you explain why that should be, like with your knowledge of what happens in Wellington, please?
Part of that is because, look, obviously, I don't know the circumstances of this particular one, but I do think that one of the challenges we often encounter is everyone wants a slightly more unique building. Like, it's got to be built for you rather than, I guess the question is, why don't we have like this is a school classroom in New Zealand design, and it just happens like that. And you can print, you could take it to the modular builders and say, look, over the next couple of years, we're going to need like 200 of these. So can you just start, and then we'll either store them or go and whack them up. That should drive the cost down a lot. I mean, I was out in Ngurumoana this morning and was driving past what looked like at least 2 big modular builds that were on the backs of trucks. There's a lot of work out there. I agree with you. I think that's bizarre. And I do genuinely think that that's, a continued issue that we have in a number of infrastructure spaces. I mean, you look at the cost, for example, of Dunedin Hospital, you look at how many hospitals we're trying to redo around the country. Whangarei needs one. I think Palmy needs one. Hastings, Napier, Nelson. Where is the like standard New Zealand design for a lot of these things so that we can modularize them? That has been one of the issues in construction generally for a while, is that everything is, differently architecturally done and what have you, and not as standardized. So I suspect part of that is that lack of standardization. We should have, this is the New Zealand standard for a classroom. It measures this much by this much, and then you figure out how to put it on the site rather than, bring on a bunch of people who might not have ever done a school before and say, hey, we do this a lot, but we'd like you to design it from scratch again, please. That I think is genuinely one of the greater issues we've got, and I'm surprised we're still not there yet. Ministry of Education should just put a contract out and say, I'd like someone to design it once and we will never do it again.
Thank you. Sounds like too much common sense.
Jennifer, did you want to ask a question?
Sure. But would you like to see more discussion in New Zealand about what are the essential parts of the economy versus the discretionary parts of the economy? It was an idea that came to me when Russia first invaded Ukraine, and in Germany, my home country. I think government sent out letters to a lot of the businesses saying, explain to us why you are essential, and we are going to, ration some energy and so forth. Yeah. Would you like, from that resilience aspect that you started from, for us to be more aware of our needs versus our wants?
To a degree, yes. I'm not sure in the current political and economic climate that would go down as well. Just in terms of,
it would take a long time to work out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is still broadly important to have that conversation. If for no better reason than if we ever do have something like COVID again, or have a similar pathway that we go down. Figuring out if your butcher can open or not would be useful, or if they're actually sort of in the top line or not. Part of that probably comes down to as well a better understanding from a central government point of view over 2 things. One, the sort of business continuity planning for the country in general, in terms of like what actually are the action plans post event. I mean, you look at, and I know government is currently working with communities around the country on the Alpine Fault 8 issue, but also the Hikurangi subduction zone going. The worry, I guess, for me is that, look, in all seriousness, if Alpine Fault 8 goes, you'll lose tens of thousands of people dead in Wellington. You'll lose probably a lot of the hydro lakes that provide energy to the country. The point there around who gets energy could actually become a more live conversation than we've ever considered it to be before. So I do think that would be useful in terms of how government would like to operate there. It would also, I think, push businesses to figure out how do they work themselves. And I guess I say that in terms of course, during COVID needs must, if your business could, you start to work from home and similar. Not everyone was directly able to do that, but businesses that could did. I think that would be useful to go through that exercise of what other changes do we need, and sort of who provides them. So, for example, I know during COVID, in Australia, they struggled probably more than we did because we had our ultra-fast broadband that had been rolled out. What's the next UFB? And what are those other things that come through? Hawke's Bay saw it last year with Gabriel around maybe we shouldn't have substations that are in the middle of floodplains and similar. Like it's a little bit, I think, of that resilience piece is is one part of it, and then how that business interaction comes in. Because I think before you get to business, you almost need to do the critical utilities bit. Like what are those pieces first? And then because if they fail, then all of the planning in the world of if you're essential or not sort of goes out the window. So I think that comes first and then the business bit.
Yeah.
It would be useful as an ongoing conversation.
Appreciate that. Just mindful that government might come to regions to ask to answer some of those questions. So if we're more prepared, I'd be more comfortable. Yeah.
The other piece though, I think, is who owns that. Like is that NEMA at a central government level? Again, Wellington coming out to you, or more importantly, asking you to feedback in there, or does it come through regional responses and similar? And I think that is genuinely one of the challenges that New Zealand does face on the civil defence front already. I know talking to people in Hawke's Bay that at one point you had I think was it the national controller who closed a supermarket because of risks of flooding and similar, and got rung 20 minutes later by the regional controller who said, well, why is this closed? I've got people who are hungry and wanting to get food. And so just I think the coordination during an emergency, I get that that's very difficult, but then questions, well, what are the structures that are in place in terms of who owns that space and who should then have the conversation? Is it local committees or is it sort of the central agency?
Thank you.
Angela.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Brad, for your presentation. Just wondering on a nationwide level, with climate and our Paris Agreement commitments, what are the risks if we don't meet our targets financially for us as a nation?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like I'm straying into areas that are definitely not my purview at that point. I mean, I think everyone legally sort of, from what I understand, sort of says that there's both nothing legal that we are required to do, but obviously we'll become a bit of an international pariah if we don't, and everyone else does. Now, that's a bit of a condition setting over if they will as well. I guess the risk probably is if we don't and everyone else does that sort of diminish our ability to continue to trade on the international stage because we don't have the right market access anymore, for example. That's probably, I think, the bigger risk, and one that will become more challenging, particularly for businesses, where that obligation is a central government one to make sure that the entire system is there. It might well become that even if your own business can sort of prove their environmental and climate change credentials, that if your entire country hasn't quite met it, then you're sort of excluded more generally. That's probably, I think, where the broader financial risk would come from. There's also probably the piece where even if you do meet it, the longer you leave it, the more expensive it's likely to be. And I mean, that is, to be fair, that's a balancing position at the moment, given high cost of living, given government debt and what have you. Like there is, I think, a difficult discussion that government will be going through in terms of how do we fund this, and more importantly, what does the pathway look like? I don't think that the idea should be that you fund nothing, say, for the next 3 years, and then when economic activity is better, you fund it a lot more. It's probably more, does the curve upward slope quickly? Is it a bit more of sort of a slower build and then sort of more over time? But the longer you leave it, often the more expensive things cost, be it climate change or infrastructure or anything else. Sort of the best time to do it is always yesterday.
Thank you.
Brad, thank you very much for your very illuminating presentation. I'm sure you've given the committee plenty to think about. Thank you very much. Just to round that out, can I have a mover and seconder to receive his report? Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jennifer. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you very much. We're running a bit behind now, but we'll go back to flood network resilience, item 12.
Page 115 in the agenda, if anyone's trying to find it.
Thank you for having me here, Mr. Chair and the committee. My name is Edmund Brown. I've worked at council since 2002 in a sort of a hydrology and science roles, particularly around river flows, rainfall and groundwater levels. And since 2016 have managed the environmental monitoring team, which in amongst its functions looks after the rainfall and river level network for flood monitoring. I'll just give a presentation which gives some of the key points from the report, and it'll be very quick. So there's three main components to our flood network. It's the instruments that are out in the field, and in the image there you see that's a river level recorder. It's got a tower. During Cyclone Gabriel, the river level came up to the bottom of the black box, and debris was all over the handrails there. It's on the Hannah Murray. Then we have the telemetry system, and that will send information that's recorded, the river level at that site. It's recorded by instruments up in that black box, and then it's radioed back into council's office. And then we have a database system which receives that information, and from there warnings and information are sent out. So the three main components. Pre-2002, our telemetry system, so on the right side of that first part of the diagram, you've got the sites like we're in that photo. Then you've got the telemetry system. We had a northern repeater that had all of our sites bar 6 going through it. We had a number of issues with that repeater. Fortunately, during non-flood times, and that prompted us to change the way we had things set up. And post 2022, we've now moved to a new provider, Lightwire. And at the moment we have 4 repeaters, so taking the information from our sites and sending it into council. This diagram, such as the 3 repeaters there you see in the middle, future progression, at the moment they send information to council. We hope in time, if one of those repeaters fails, we're then able to get a mesh where they'll be able to send to another repeater beside it and then into council. At the moment, we don't have that capability. That's will grow as the Lightwire largens its network. But it is giving us greater resilience because we've got less sites going through each repeater. And it is the telemetry, which is where our greatest weakness is, simply because if you lose a rainfall site, there's another site usually nearby, so you can get an indication. But if you lose telemetry, that might have many sites coming through it, and so that cuts off that aspect. And so Hawke's Bay, sorry, that's smaller than I thought it would be on the big screen. Hawke's Bay had a similar setup to what we had pre-2002, and one of their big issues was their key repeater lost its backup power and then it wasn't able to operate. So most of its sites, or nearly all of its sites, couldn't report to council. They didn't have an issue so much of sites in the field being destroyed. That was less of a problem. Most of their sites were still okay in the field. They just couldn't get the information in. So we've gone towards a new provider, and the way they're set up is very focused on resilience with backup power and trying to get a wider network of more repeaters. We've got at our field sites going for newer solar panels and looking towards a 5-day power source. The importance of that, a lot of these are remote sites, and so it's either solar panels, but solar panels at the time, daytime you get data, nighttime you don't. And that was one of the incidents we had during the flood where someone stole our batteries at a site as the cyclone was occurring. They must have had a greater need for it. So we could get data during the day, measuring the rainfall, but we couldn't at night time. So as good as your resilience can be, there are other issues out there. And then in our council database where we receive the information, we're now developing a standalone hydrotel. So that's the database that receives the information and will send out warnings. And that's around a resilience that if we were hit by a virus within our computer system, such as the hospital board, we want something that's standing alone for that worst case scenario, the 2 events occur at the same time. And Coromandel is one of our, particularly the eastern side, reliance on cellular communication rather than the radio network that you're seeing here. So we're looking at getting onto the satellite system for that. Some of the issues with satellite systems or other communications is they use a lot of power. And so that's why we're having to upgrade solar panels, more batteries. Some of these batteries are very heavy, like if you think truck batteries, people are having to carry them into sites. We have been moving to the lithium batteries, which are a lot lighter and have a better life. So there are some advances there and saving people's backs. And then we're also, as a lower priority, as I said, assessing if there's key sites where we think a second sensor is needed. But as from the Hawke's Bay experience and even our own experience, it's not so much the sensors that are failing, it's keeping the communication going. But we are looking at some of the sites where, you know, what are our real key sites? And when I say we're looking at them, ICM and their flood resilience team, they're our key customer. So asking them, what are the ones you can't do without during an event? And we've already had those conversations, so we have a pretty good feel. We've also had a bit of, we'll show it in a photo as a better example. And then if all goes well with satellites for the Coromandel, we'll look to moving that out across the region. So that will mean even if we don't get more repeaters from Lightwire coming on board in a timeframe that suits us, we will have the secondary network. So all rainfall and river flow sites will have two forms of communication back to the council. And so this diagram, which isn't that flash, but the red circles just indicate where the Lightwire sites are, which are sending back from the other sites in the region. And these are just examples of the Lightwire repeater sites. So huge amounts of solar panels for power and batteries, and they deal with rural broadband communication, but they've modified their sites to take our radio. And it's about $15,000 a site for them to modify it for our needs. If we were to set one up from scratch, it would be 50,000 plus. In this photo is just an example. So the green tower is a classic Ministry of Works flow tower where you have instruments either taking water in from the river. That's about $150,000 to replace. What you see now is that cantilevered arm poking out, and it has a radar on it. We get slightly less accuracy, which isn't so important in floods, more during the drought management. What it means is you have your sensor out of the water. And so that's a real positive because it means debris, flood damage, logs coming down. In most situations aren't hitting it. Yeah, so that's also in situations where we haven't got a sensor out of the water, that's where we might look at a second sensor. But then you have to find a location where you can install it cantilevered out, that it will be robust. And as Hawke's Bay found, you can't always trust your bridges. So yes. So some of the key points are on there. So the network is critical to people and property. So that's why we've been making this continual improvement. And it's been useful because I am in the fortunate position of being the convener for the Environmental Data SIG, which is all the regional councils who manage this sort of networks. And our last meeting in November was looking at the Hawke's Bay to see what we can all do and to see how we all sit. So when I say we're doing 5 days of battery storage at a site, that's in line with all other councils. There is conversation, could we get out to 10? But yeah, so we're in line or exceeding other expectations. So there's less of a priority to replace the sensors or to get more sensors, but I note that ICM has requested for more rain gauges in their LTP bid, which is referenced in the references in the report. That's more that on the Coromandel, there are so many small catchments and some of these storms are so small that they're falling in between rain gauges. So that's more getting a more diverse network. And yeah, our focus is on our radio network with Lightwire, and then towards the satellite as our backup. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Just one question, if I may, please. Ed, I just want to make sure that we're not in conflict from the recommendations of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council independent review, where they're saying that they warned against regional councils contracting out components of the telemetry system. Then went to so far suggest that commercial providers should not be used. We seem to be focusing on one provider, which is Lightwire. I assume that's only for the connectivity back to council rather than actually hydrological assets?
That is correct. It is just for the telemetry, but that was also their concern. And their concern was that you get a contractor and then you just assume they had everything on board. So one of the bullet points that we've got in there is the testing that we have with our provider now. So check the testing that we do to make sure they got the right battery backup and everything else. So, yeah,
Thank you.
Warren.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Ed, does this program drop into the increased infrastructure we're putting into the bottom end of the Firth there and the coastal monitoring at all?
Not directly. So is that the coastal monitoring that Mike Townsend's doing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yep.
that falls within our team, but that's more.
So outside of the
Yeah.
scope of this. Okay, thanks. And obviously just a point around security. I know the radio stations and stuff have big issues with the repeaters getting batteries flogged and stuff like that. So I just hope that's a high priority with this increased investment around the sites. And even possibly camera linkage, because before they take the batteries, we get a photo of them.
Yes,
Cheers.
and touching on cameras there, that is the advance in technology that will be our next focus, or is our current focus for floods. You can take a video image and convert it to flow. So, but also catch people when they're disappearing with your kit.
Angela.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed, for your report. Just a question around staff health and safety. Does this new system limit that risk to staff physically having to go out into the field during events?
Not so much the telemetry, because as I say, it was to a third provider, both the previous system and the current system. If a site goes down during a flood, if it's a high priority site, we are kitted to go out, but we weigh it up. So if that's a vital site, decision to be made. We have numerous forms of communication, particularly the in-reach and other aspects. But we do try not to go out if we don't have to.
Thank you.
Robbie.
Yeah, I just want to just back up what Warren's saying about telemetry being stolen and stuff, like all the stuff that we put in the Ottaway Basin in the last 10 years has all been pinched. All the stuff we put up on Thompson's Track all gets pinched. It's a real issue that we spend a lot of money and it just, some hiker or someone that wants it for their pig hunting or their bush power system just comes along, cuts it all off and takes it away. So yeah, it's a real issue.
Yeah. We have found theft hasn't been so bad in the last few years. When we first started and solar panels were smaller and easier to walk away with, but now they are getting larger.
Just one very quick question. So
Yes.
some time ago, I asked the question about operational technology, which was a broad question, being air gapped from the corporate systems. And we waited to the next meeting and we're told it was, but it seems like your hydrotel system's not air gapped. It's inside the firewalls of the corporate system. Are you looking to take that out and have it completely?
Yes, exactly. That is exactly where we're going.
Yeah, good.
Yes. Just the difficulty when you take something out, but at times it needs information from within to make sure you're not a historical virus or issue isn't transferred. So we're working through all those things, how to keep it up to date and relevant, but not connected.
And it gets complicated because someone's
Yeah.
sitting with their email account on the computer and they log into it. So yeah, it is complicated. I understand that, but it is kind of important. In Hawke's Bay, one of the problems was in the East Valley that the regional council had proposed a cell phone system where they'd call everyone if there was a flood, and then they cancelled it because of cost. And then, you know, sort of 2 years later, a whole lot of people drowned and they looked a bit silly. I mean, so this has gone beyond the scope of what you're saying, but are there areas of high risk where the sort of warning systems are required?
Well, our hydrotel system has a number of landowners, not just council staff, who are connected to it. And so they will receive messages. And so, yeah, so that's for stop movement or just heads up. So
Yeah, they'll receive messages to remove cattle from floodplains and stuff like that, that the water level's rising at so many meters per hour or centimeters per hour. And that's, you're not, you know, they get that sort of, especially on the Kringahaki and those sort of catchments, that's water level can rise meters in no time they get those sort of warnings, yeah.
Outstanding, thank you.
Thank you. Can I have oh, thank you, Warren. Seconded, please. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Insurance program update, item 13 on page 120.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this report is just for your information and happy to take it as read. Probably the key points are just noting overall around our insurance program and increase in costs of 8.2% in the last year. And the other point just in relation to our infrastructure cover. So previously we'd had what was called a sidecar policy, which provided sort of 100% coverage for lower level events on the advice of Aon and an agreement with the insurance consortium that operates in the region. That coverage has been dropped. I think we've seen experience in terms of claims and incidences that give us more confidence around co-sharing in that space. So that has given a significant saving within that program, allowing effectively that cover to be reasonably cost neutral in this renewal period. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions?
Yep, it was just the time frame of when council's likely to have that discussion or the committee around moving to more
Self-insurance.
self-insurance. Just noting it's called out a lot that we will. I'm just wondering time-wise.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
The groundwork underway.
Well, to be fair, no. The focus, it's an issue that was called out through the LTP process in terms of our disaster recovery reviews. It is something that I think we need to look at, but you know, within the region or cross-regionally as well, in terms of what those self-insurance mechanisms may be. And I think that program needs to be done in conjunction with our insurance advisors. I know I had received a proposal that effectively a fund manager had worked up with another council, but had shared that with our insurance advisor, and they were sort of like, interesting. I think that actually involved effectively for us, it would be the setting aside a portion of our investment fund into a response recovery fund. And so whether that's the right thing to do, whether given our financial position, if the worst happened, we actually have the ability and the headroom to borrow rather than using that investment fund. So there's a number of those considerations that we just need to work through in a structured way, but no plan in place just at the moment to do that, but noted as a priority.
Thank you. Yeah, the reason I asked was just because it looks like they're going to still be trending up. So obviously each year that we could get ahead of it would be great. And my other question was just around, since there was reference in the report to working with, well, the territorial authorities, kind of us bulking together at times, whether they doing this or can be doing this alongside or as a collaboration, say through collab.
Yeah, so our insurance program is done
Altogether
within the region.
Yeah.
So we have a number of shared policies. The infrastructure cover is an example of that. And with that, we get a diversification of risk that we're actually going to the market with.
Great.
So that's why I say we need, you know, we have an interest in doing it, but what's the opportunity to do that? Either collaboratively and in conjunction with our broker on our own.
Since they're quite different assets to the TA.
They are,
their
but
whole
that gives
category.
diversification from an
right.
insurance underwriter perspective, which is
Mindful of their rates
valuable.
of the TAs. You know, they might want to look at it.
Warren.
Janine, just real quick, that infrastructure cover of 316,000, was that part of the roughly 2 million savings that was indicated in the LTP that came from in-house?
No, no, it wasn't explicitly counted in that. When we were bringing the budget to council at the beginning of this year, that has been set based on these renewal costs, and the movement forward is based on the sort of 8% type uplift going forward as well. So it hasn't been an explicit reduction, but it's wrapped up in terms of the overall budget position, I guess.
Thank you.
Okay, Robbie.
Thank you. I just add on to that conversation that Jennifer had, that most of your brokerages now have a self-insurance policy. So it's just actually just opening up the Pandora's box and getting on with it. It's that there's that many of them now have that policy written, and where you want to fit in it and have different options. I think you just need to get on with it, because, like, I understand Firestone New Zealand insure themselves now because of the risk of fire. Theirs is just so great that they self-insure.
Service leavers.
Pardon?
Probably around the fire service leavers.
Yeah. So there's a lot of big businesses self-insure now. So
Yes, totally. To be clear, we do it as well through our existing disaster recovery reserves.
Yeah.
So that is an explicit self-insurance mechanism that we can actually go there before we're needing to interact with any commercial insurance, which means that we can determine what our deductible level is. And so it's how much risk is this council willing to take on itself versus where it wants to transfer that and pay for that through a premium.
But that's more of a reserve fund, though, isn't it? Not actually an insurance policy.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So they're not the same thing. Where once you go,
it is self-insurance.
it is self, but it's not it's a. Anyway.
Yeah, and that's my concern, and that's why I've raised this as an issue and opportunity. That the costs of damage in the face of a changing climate are going to get more significant. And so how are we positioned in the most resilient way to be able to respond to that, both from a risk transference, but from a self-insurance perspective as well. So definitely on the plan, just not in action at the moment.
Okay. Can I have a mover and seconder to receive this report, please? Bruce, Jennifer, all those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Item 14, key projects activity update, page 123.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll kick off with our Shovel Ready Work Programme. So a programme summary is provided for you on page 124 of your agenda, and pleased to report that the programme is going well. We've got a number of quite major projects ongoing at the moment. We've got our asset rationalisation project out in the Hauraki Plains, which is going well. Some time challenges, but we do expect it to be able to deliver that project within this particular construction season. Churchill East Pump Station, which several councillors have had an opportunity to see, that's reached a significant milestone with the pumps getting lifted into place last week, and we're expecting to see the coffer dam come out in a couple of weeks for that, so that project is going well. Our foreshore stop banks have had some time challenges as well, particularly navigating the dual use of that area with the Hauraki Rail Trail. The team are working through that and managing that really closely in terms of what we can expect to achieve within this earthwork season. It's one of our particular projects that is weather dependent, and so we are closely monitoring that. Of course, we have our vessel, which is underway, so that project as well is going well. We have had some budget pressures with the mooring aspect of it, which represents about 10% of the project. That contract has been awarded now, and we expect to commence that construction in a week or two. What we have been able to do is do a review of our project budget and release some project contingency into this particular aspect of the project, so that we can award these contracts with contingency provided as well. The vessel build itself is going well, and we hit a few milestones, including the naming of the vessel earlier in the month, so that is going well, and certainly still continue to manage that very closely to make sure that we are staying on top of it with regard to time, scope and budget. I'll just take as read the key achievements and looking forward. Obviously, looking forward, we've got a number of projects coming to conclusion and we will be also planning to wrap up the program in the not too distant future as well. I am joined by Julie Beaufort, our program manager online, so I'll have to take any questions from the committee and Julie can help me with some more detail. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg. Chris.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Greg, can you enlighten us as to who is paying for the delays caused by the rail trail up in the Thames estuary project? They're obviously pretty significant now. It's been going on for what, second year?
Yeah. And so we are at the moment. However, we are having discussions with other project stakeholders, including Hauraki District Council. We do have a memorandum of understanding between our two councils in terms of how that rail trail is managed and how it interacts with our flood protection schemes. And so we are undertaking those discussions at the moment to land those.
So have we tracked the extra costs associated with that and separated them out from the weather events and whatever other delays so we can actually sheet home the liability?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
No more questions. Tracy, are you going to speak to us then about freshwater policy review?
Morning committee members and councillors. I do just have a few slides, so I will try and share things. Joined, excuse me, I will just seem to have fallen off. Let me just rejoin. Quite as smooth as Ed was with his. I don't know how he was lurking about. So this is an update. I do not have the luxury as Greg has to say everything is on target and showing in the green. It is definitely not showing in the green. As I reported at our project reference group catch up about 3 weeks ago, the goalposts have changed. Government's grabbed them and moved those goalposts. At the last meeting, the formal meeting of the committee, we also reported that the project was red because we said, look, we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve by December 2004, I've got up there. By December, might have been a better date, by December 2024, we need more time. A gem that came through in the amendments prior to Christmas extended that time to 2027 and also signalled that there will be changes coming up in the legislation. While there will be several tweakings, I think the government's referred to them as, there will be a substantive change. But in no stage along the messaging that we've had from government is stop what you're doing. They are saying being cautious. There are significant implications for the project. I guess for me, it was a positive and it does show that the project management discipline that the organisation's been maturing its way through. It was a known unknown. It was identified as one of our key project risks, legislative change, incoming government. The size of it, I think we probably underestimated, but it was identified. We're always operating in constant change, and I guess the challenge for us in this project is to maintain project momentum, but doing so in a mindful and prudent manner. We've had that message from a number of the sectors who we're having conversations with and also with our councillors. This is really just saying the key message, and it's key message that previously when we've talked about this, questions have been, so what else is happening with the other sector, the other 14 lucky souls who are also going through this? there is a variability on that continuum. A number of councils, the term that the government has used is there seems to be a thumbing the noses at impending change and a tracking on and crashing ahead. Now, I can understand that if you were only 2 months away from notification and had made the significant investment, I can understand why you'd say, well, look, we're still crashing ahead to have things notified by December. The majority of councils, such as ours, are taking a moment's pause to say, okay, let's recast, what do we do? Importantly, the second bullet point there cannot be underestimated. We already have some sector entities who have threatened judicial review to councils who are either not going fast enough or are going too fast. So you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, quite frankly. So once we recast the project and have everything lined up, I am going to seek a legal review and a quantification of legal risks, because the time and the dollars that we think we have already banked into our LTP as saving, I don't want to spend those on a judicial review. That's a bit of an exercise in futility. For us, that key focus is focusing on what's important in the Waikato, what will make a difference, what economic analysis we need to support that, any additional research, and a focus of engagement with our iwi and our sectors. Previously, it was a bit more broad ranging. There's an opportunity to focus on it. We've said before, we've got the Environment Court decision on Plan Change 1. We had a court minute out about 3 weeks ago indicating a mid-year decision, which is great, because previously we'd heard end of the year. The court minute identifies the complexity the poor court's trying to navigate through. We've got a review of Te Ture Whai Mana, and I don't think it's prudent to notify a plan before we have a new MPSFM. We will get enough signals, we'll get enough of a gingerbread trail to understand where some of the changes are needed. So I had hoped to have all the information to you. I got my expectations recalibrated by the project team last week in terms of the difference between a Ruapehu and an Everest. And similarly, I don't like bringing half-baked scones. What I can indicate, and I know it was something that Mr. Chair, you asked for, what are the indications in terms of budget? This is the diagram that we took into the LTP. Already we're indicating just the change in TAC will likely save 900k over the 10-year life of the project. What it does do obviously is pushes out the peaks. Now, this is predicated on an existing statutory framework. That could change. So pretty good understanding of the next 3 years. After that, goodness knows. So this is something that we'll be checking in every 6 months with the intel we have. Taking the lead from the Chief Executive, we are relying on formal intel, not he said, she said, because there's an awful lot of that coming out of central government at the moment. So unless it's public and unless we've seen the whites of the eyes, the ink on the paper, those will be the directions we're taking. So the project status is red. It is unfortunate. It's not unusual. What the next step is to be recast the project. We'll be bringing that back to a council workshop mid-April, I think we're hoping. What we will have to do is then go through a significant project change request. When we do that, I anticipate that time, cost and quality will be green, but that the scope will remain somewhat ambiguous for at least 12 to 18 months. However, the costs that we're looking to save, I think we will be able to whittle that down over the period of the next 18 months and bring it in within the total project cost, but to look out for those spectres on the horizon that may impact that, such as judicial reviews.
Chris.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that, Tracy. Just a couple of points I'd like to make. Before any money is spent on judicial review, I would encourage our chief executive to engage with the minister responsible for the freshwater policies. I understand he's going to be meeting with him not too distant future, because if we can get something in writing, that just takes that risk away, and we don't need to spend any more money, and it's much cheaper for our chief executive to communicate directly rather than us go through a third party and get some sort of safety net put around us. I don't think it's necessary from what I've heard. And I'd like you to confirm that we're not spending money on consultants at the moment in the freshwater policy area. We had over $1 million in the budget. Just like to make sure that that's not happening, please.
Two matters. A judicial review is something that somebody will take against us, and we are duty bound to respond to that in accordance with any matters set out by the court. So we definitely won't be seeking a judicial review of anything or anybody. What we had always anticipated when we recast the project, that we would be doing that. Once that's done, we will be sending letters to ministers saying this is what we're doing. So there is visibility. In terms of a judicial review, we know that there are, I'm aware of 2 entities that sit at either end of the go fast, don't do anything spectrum, that have both said to other regional councils, if you don't do what we ask, we may judicially review you. It's not something anybody actively seeks, and should a judicial review be lodged against us for either being constructive or not constructive in somebody else's eyes, that will be made fully aware. Firstly, we'll inform our insurers and our councillors and this committee. We've dealt with two in the last 5 years. Yes, we are still continuing to spend money on consultants because we are still working and we are using those consultants to assist us to navigate our way through the maze at the moment. The spend that we are spending on the consultants is demonstrably less than what was projected to be spent this year. But we are still spending money on consultants to assist us to navigate through this process because we don't have all the capability in-house at the moment. And as we've reported previously to this committee, would be unlikely to receive that in this present climate as well. I'm more than happy to provide members with what we projected at the start of this financial year to spend and what we have spent to date.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
Hopefully I'll have all the answers at the next committee. Thank you.
The next one is
Good afternoon. I'm just covering for Brent Sinclair on the Irish Next Gen project. So I've just got a verbal update, and I'll just go through a few key points. The first one is that the project continues to progress as large as expected. In terms of some recent key activities, there was a detailed scheduling workshop across all the councils last month. Some relatively minor adjustments over the overall schedule of some of those councils' implementations, largely to better reflect the Christmas shutdown for those councils that straddle the Christmas period. So it's getting down to detailed scheduling across all the 9, soon to be 10 councils participating. The key thing for us in terms of when we implement is we're now completely aligned with Bay of Plenty Regional Council. Previously, we had a 3-month lag behind them, but by aligning them completely in parallel, we've got a much better opportunity to share activities such as training and change management and so on. So that's a good outcome for us. We now start our implementation in October 2025. There's obviously work to do to be prepared for that implementation between now and then. The first council, our pilot council, is Otago Regional Council, and they start their implementation November this year. So they're well into their pre-implementation activities. Just a couple of other things going on recently. A number of WRC staff have been involved in workshops over recent months. They're largely around the consistent good practice processes, just more detailed refinements of those, and the walkthrough of the Datacom Datascape product as it's being completed in the different phases. So getting much more visibility of the technology solution and making sure that aligns well with our to-be processes. So product acceptance testing is underway as that development heads towards completion. That's involving a number of WRC team members alongside the other council members. That's really the verbal update. Happy to cover any questions.
Thank you, John. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks for the report. And there's a comprehensive risk management thing here, which is great program management. But it's quite a long list. So what really keeps you awake at night with this project?
Probably the biggest area of concern, and to be honest, I don't think it's a sleepless thing, but the biggest area of concern, I think, is our own capacity to resource the activities that we're responsible for. The programme of across all the councils is being managed by RSHL and Datacom. The product development is taking existing and proven product and refining it for the regional sector. So, we've got a high level of comfort around that. The cost of that development is a fixed price cost. And the fact that it's a shared programme across 9 councils shares the risk as well. So that side is I think, less of a concern. Within the council, we have to resource activities like data migration, any integration to any of our specific technology solutions, and the sort of change management within our council is probably a key as well, because this is implementing standard agreed operating processes across all the councils. So we will all have to adjust to the one way of doing things, and that will inevitably come with a change management challenge.
Any questions of John? No. Thank you, John. Can I have a mover and seconder to receive the key project activity update? Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Bruce. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Annual leave management, wellbeing and health and safety, item 16, page 134.
Good afternoon. I will take the report as read and point you to a couple of key points as we go through it. The first being really the annual leave management. You'll see that is trending in a positive direction. Chris has continued to share his desire to have the balances reduced with the executive, and they're working across the organisation with senior managers to ensure that happens. And you'll see at the end of the document there, we have a line for booked leave. So while people are over, we ask that is looked at to be booked into the future where possible. As we move through the report, the health and safety reporting continues to be good. We have opportunities to learn from what's been happening, and we are pleased with that. Something that is a bit more of a concern as we progress through to point 23 is the EAP stats there. You'll see the wheels, both with work issues on one side and the left and personal issues on the right. Work issues make up about 20% of our EAP usage versus 80% in the personal space. And you'll see that the green band there of anxiety makes up 60% of that. So that's an increase that we're seeing, and that's trended now over a few months. We've contacted EAP to find out if we can actually delve a bit more deeply into that, to find out what that anxiety is made up with. But unfortunately, for confidentiality reasons, they aren't able to get that level of detail. So the executive have discussed this, and it's been a discussion in the directorates with the managers, to be cautious of it and cognizant of it, I guess. And we've also linked in with EAP to find out what else we can actually do. They have now provided us with an app that will give better, quicker access to all of the range of services they provide. And that's currently sitting with our wellbeing team, and they're trialing the app to find out, if it's a good thing that we should look at adopting across the organisation. And we hope to see the results of that in a couple of weeks. We've also supported the Wellbeing team in a recent recruitment drive with some staff turnover. It had reduced in number, and we've been lucky to get another 7 people across the organisation to join that and engage in wellbeing across the organisation and have a closer link with the executive. So they're coming up with an annual plan, and that's going to be shared at the executive table on a monthly basis, so that we know what's going on and that we can support it and ensure that we kind of continue to do our best in that space. So that was the highlights of the report. I'm happy to take any questions.
Really good to see the leave balances trending in the right direction.
Yeah.
Appreciate that, knowing it's a long time ago that conversation started and it continues to go in the right direction.
Yeah, it's positive. Yeah, thank you.
Chris?
I'd just like to make a comment that I think that the personal issues with anxiety being highlighted as the major issue is fully understandable in the current environment where it is challenging for everybody out there. And we're not unique. And I'm sure if you did that, any other organisation get a similar result. Just a function of where we live at the moment.
That's right, Chris. Although looking nationally at the results, we are higher than the national average, but I agree with what you're saying there. There are a lot of pressures on people. I guess one of the positives of our EAP scheme is that family members can also avail of it. So that's really helpful too, because there's, a number of things going on out there, as you know, financial pressures. We've heard Brad this morning, and everybody's not too far removed from illness and other bits and pieces. So there's always something in that space.
Chris, I think you need to look at those graphs. They're very small, but Waikato Region's performance, both in the personal issues and the work issues, is higher than the rest of the EAP population in a number of areas. I think there is a real concern there to deal with.
Yeah, so if you look at that bar, Chris, it's about 25% looking at nationally across the different organisations that EAP provide assistance to, and we're sitting at 60%. So there is a difference there, but yeah.
Joe, just to note that that data is a 12-month period, as opposed to like being able to see the trend data and, maybe a rolling 12-month monthly, but showing the monthly participation, something like that as well, to see where spikes are. I mean, Christmas time can be a really stressful time for people. Been a lot of conversation about this at the executive table, and while we acknowledge we can't necessarily do anything about the anxiety, that is the person that turns up to work for us, and so we can't ignore it. But I think being able to see some of that more granular information around trends would be really helpful for this committee as well.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And I've linked in with the general manager at EAP services there, Chris Cooper, and he's looking to provide that. So we're hopeful to get some more reporting on a more regular basis so that we can actually see those trends. So hopefully in the next report, you'll be able to see that more granular detail, which will be really helpful.
Angela.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd be really interested in that granular data, just for overall trends for demographic of who's accessing help. And it is really pleasing to see that people are choosing to use the services as well. So I might take it offline with you, Stu.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
it tends to be
we've
younger
talked
people.
before about one thing that I'm mindful of, but thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Angela.
Warren.
Yeah, so same thread as Angela, just interested to see if we can get down to how much is staff, how much is family, demographic, that sort of information. It might just help with those trends and see what's coming through. Thanks, Stu.
Certainly, thank you.
No more questions. Excuse me. No more questions. Can we have a mover and second of them, please? Thank you, Warren. Thank you, Angela. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you.
Thank you.
Policy review schedule.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is the regular reporting in terms of the list of policies that come in front of this committee. The one key one that's been updated through this review cycle is the risk management framework. So that now includes the concepts around the interconnectedness of risks and also more explicitly addressing the reference to project and program risks as opposed to the strategic risk level. Marked up copy of the revised policy is provided for the committee for your endorsement. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions?
Right, so excellent, cool, very good. I love the policy. Page 148, it's got the roles of everyone. And so it's got all staff identify and team leader, manager, identify risks. It doesn't explicitly say to follow procedures to actually mitigate the risks. It's actually the people have to do the stuff that has been identified by the leaders, which is in the paragraphs above. I don't know whether you think you need to put that on or not, but I just invite you to consider it. And I don't think it needs to come back here, but I just invite you to consider it.
Thank you.
Good point. So can we have a mover and seconder if there are no more questions? And we got to receive the report and to endorse the revised risk management framework. Paul? Thank you. Chris, thank you. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you. Protected disclosures. Welcome, Connie.
Thank you. Okay, cool. I will take it as read. We are coming back based on the last meeting in December, just following the recommendation of the committee to look a bit further into the principles of who we would choose as a delegate for the chair as a receiver of disclosures. So we considered the options, or the options are actually that we considered in the table 1, and we are recommending to have the delegate as the second independent, as Paul. But yeah, happy to take any questions.
Yeah, I wasn't here last meeting, but I agree with the change and happy to move it.
Warren.
Just a question around cost implement. What's going to happen to cost? Implications was the word I was looking for. Thank you. I knew it'd come. I knew it'd come. Yeah, just obviously using our independence and stuff, and along those lines, has it been thought of, touched on?
Yeah, so through the chair, that would be an additional cost to deal with those matters if they arose. Obviously, that is only one pathway for disclosure anyway. So staff can go through the chief executive. We also have our whistleblower hotline as well. So using this path, yeah, there is a cost because we pay for the independent members' time, but that isn't the only avenue.
So I just, probably Paul, coming to you and Graham yourself, you're happy that there is that possible added workload, etc.?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I do think that the whole purpose with this policy is to make sure there's the least obstacles for people to raise issues.
And that's obviously the feedback we've had come back through. So yeah, no, happy to support. Thanks.
Yeah, so in the last discussion, I raised the question about gender of the receivers of complaints. So I mean, I'm happy to take whatever role that council would actually like. I'm very comfortable to support the council there. But I'm a white cis male, middle age, so am I the right person for everyone? I don't know.
It's never too late.
think there's enough choice there with the old, there is the hotline through PwC, which then if
Comes,
is
it
it-
actually is notified to me. So I get any reports that come through there. So do identify differently to
Yeah.
Paul.
I think there's enough opportunities for people to work around it.
But I guess just to confirm that Connie did go back to the people who had been involved in the trials to gather their feedback as well. So Connie, I don't know whether gender ever came up in conversation.
No, it was discussed. We did discuss it following your comments, and there wasn't it didn't come up as like a large concern for it. And if they did, they would find like a manager or someone else they felt comfortable to raise it to. So yeah, so to the chair's point, there were some other avenues they would use. Yeah.
This resolution, does that actually cover, because we are presumably endorsing, I think this committee approves that policy.
Oh, please keep typing though.
I won't watch. No.
This is where I need AI.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, Warren. All those in favour say aye. Contrary, carried. Thank you. And thank you, Connie. Gifts and benefits register.
Happy to take this one as read, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Keep up.
Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Oh, sorry.
No, just a quick question. I've obviously been remiss looking at the councillors that have declared and not declared. And sorry, for clarification, do we have a commitment to declare every month?
Yes. Yep. So I understand that there's a reminder that comes through to you when you're completing your
Is it? Okay.
Should be a pop-up in the
No.
Yeah, it's a recurring calendar appointment, but I haven't received anything as part of it.
Okay.
What would be simpler is if the online form link could be included in the online calendar reminder, if it's not.
Actually, another avenue that could also work is in the Excel spreadsheet for expense claims. You could declare it in there each month, then it automatically comes through. So that might be a nice thing that you're doing anyway, and it's just an extra
Probably easier
word.
to clear it regularly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And given that you
It's
have
part
to
of your
declare
fee
declined gifts as well, high risk.
Yeah.
Made a note of this. Make it link.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great, even just so you can click straight through as you're doing the other habit that you're already doing.
Any other questions or comments? Not, can we have a mover and seconder, please? Cool. All right. Okay. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you. Which brings us to the resolution to exclude the public. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Warren. All those in favour say aye. Against, carried. Thank you.
Moment, please.
Right.
Just a brief